earlier.
Yeah, miles earlier. I mean, 1 hour earlier. It was just, a bit of a shame. Of course, they took a very cautious approach. Of course, we spoke about it after Silverstone to be a little bit more cautious because there was quite a lot of water there. But this, for me, was then the other extreme of waiting. And it just ruins a nice classic wet race as well. So we either still try to push to go for a proper wet race, or we just say, you know what, we stop racing in the wet and we just wait for it to be dry. But that's not what you want, right? I mean, I think we can have some really cool wet racing, like it showed also, I guess, at Silverstone, So, that compromises then, of course, today with the rear wing. But at the end of the day, the promise that we have for the car and tire management is still there. It doesn't matter what rear wing you put on the car, and that also hurt us a little bit today in the race. We then changed the clipping a bit around. But yeah, when you run that wing, of course, naturally on a track like this, you always have that trouble. So we did the best we could. I think immediately when I said it on the radio, we made some changes and it was much nicer around the lap. But yeah, we know what we have to work on. Unfortunately, it's not that straightforward to fix.
Red Bull's glory days are over. That's what Max Verstappen said, and no one saw it coming. A phrase like that, in the heart of the paddock, could signal the start of an internal storm at Red Bull. What do you think? Is Red Bull really in decline? Let us know in the comments. Is Verstappen losing faith in his team, or is this a strategic move to pressure from within? Today, I'll explain what's behind Verstappen's harshest statements this year, just after the 2025 Belgian GP. There's frustration, technical pressure, and a possible rift with Red Bull. Max Verstappen arrived at the 2025 Belgian Grand Prix in an unusually difficult situation. For the first time in years, he wasn't leading the World Championship, but Oscar Piastri, the young McLaren talent who has established himself as this season's greatest rival. The gap between the two before the Spa race was 69 points, a considerable gap for a driver who has dominated Formula One for 4 consecutive seasons. This context is key to understanding the growing tension within the Red Bull team and the explosive statements that would follow. The Spa-Francorchamps circuit, one of the most demanding on the calendar, featured highly variable conditions, with periods of dry track and others of intermittent rain. Verstappen and his team tried to adapt the RB21 as best they could to these variations, but it was no easy task. In the sprint, the team opted for a low downforce configuration, which allowed Max to take advantage of the Kemmel Straight to make decisive overtaking moves. However, qualifying for the main race was a very different story. Red Bull modified the car's setup, opting for a higher downforce rear wing in anticipation of a possible rainy race. This decision, although strategic, came at a high cost. The RB21 lost top speed and, even more importantly, overall balance. Verstappen couldn't feel comfortable behind the wheel, and this imbalance directly translated into his times. He finished 4th on the grid, his worst starting position since the Bahrain Grand Prix earlier this year. For a driver accustomed to starting from pole, this result is a clear symptom that something isn't working as it should. What's truly striking is not just the result, but what it symbolizes. Verstappen hasn't lost any talent or determination, but the car no longer performs as it did before. All of this is happening while Red Bull is still trying to find a clear direction for its developments. The RB21, despite the improvements introduced, hasn't quite adapted to certain circuits, and Spa has been the perfect example of that vulnerability. Verstappen has so far been the team's great lifeline, capable of squeezing performance out of nowhere, but even he is beginning to show signs of discomfort. Most revealing is that in his statement when asked about his commitment to the team amid rumors of internal tensions, he replied, "The team can always count on me. I will always give my best, whoever the boss is." This seemingly conciliatory phrase actually has a double meaning. On the one hand, it reaffirms his professionalism. It makes it clear that he will continue to compete at the highest level regardless of the environment. But on the other, it casts a shadow over the team's current management, headed by Laurent Mekies, who took the reins after the departure of key figures from the previous team. By naming the boss, without directly mentioning him, Verstappen suggests that his confidence is not 100%, and that this relationship may be being tested, following up on the important statement Verstappen made when discussing the car's performance. "We need to review the high downforce setup. It was strange. More drag and less balance." That technical criticism seems minor, but it's profoundly significant. It's Max pointing the finger directly at the technical team's decisions. He's not criticizing a single error, but rather an entire aerodynamic concept applied to the RB21 for the circuit. And when the star driver begins to openly doubt the technical department's solutions, it's because disagreements are escalating. In Formula One, these kinds of observations are rarely made public unless frustration has already crossed a certain threshold. This kind of language, dry, technical, yet full of hidden emotional content, is typical of drivers seeking to provoke an internal reaction. Verstappen is demanding answers, changes, decisions. He doesn't want to repeat what happened at Spa for the remainder of the season. And if he doesn't see an immediate response, it won't be surprising if he increases the pressure with new statements. What is clear is that these are no longer just casual statements or temporary frustrations. It's a stance, and it's a dangerous stance for Red Bull if it doesn't manage to rectify the situation soon. These words, spoken on such a tense weekend with the championship at stake, are far from anecdotal. They represent a visible breach of trust between driver and team. And when a champion of Verstappen's caliber begins to voice his grievances, what's at stake isn't just a race or a season. It could be the entire future of the project. Red Bull arrived at the Belgian Grand Prix with a move that many consider decisive, a package of updates specifically designed to try to reverse the course of a season that was slipping away from them. These improvements were not only technical, they were also symbolic. The goal was clear: to reinforce the RB21 in the areas where it had been showing weaknesses, especially on medium-load circuits like Spa. However, the result was far from what they expected. The theory promised a substantial improvement, but in practice, they found a car that was difficult to handle, lacking balance, and that didn't respond with the force Verstappen needed. The modifications affected several sensitive areas of the car. Red Bull introduced a new design for the front wing with different geometry for the first two elements. This sought to increase downforce, particularly useful in low to medium-speed corners, such as those found in the middle section of the Spa track. They also installed additional winglets on the front suspension, inspired by an aerodynamic solution McLaren had used quite successfully. These parts were intended to better channel airflow to the rest of the car, improving overall stability and reducing turbulence. In addition, the cooling inlets and side pods were revised, increasing their volume and merging the winglets to improve the engine's thermal efficiency during long runs. In parallel, the team also worked on the engine cover. They redesigned certain profiles to facilitate heat extraction, which is key in unstable conditions like those at Spa-Francorchamps, where air temperature and humidity can change dramatically in a matter of minutes. Even the rear wheels were modified with new winglets, designed to generate more downforce without altering the car's balance. On paper, each of these decisions made sense. They were intended to give the RB21 more stable handling, improved cooling capacity, and greater overall cornering efficiency. But what seemed like clear progress in simulations and wind tunnel testing failed to fully translate to asphalt. Furthermore, the lack of track time to properly adapt these parts played a key role. Free practice sessions were marked by unstable weather conditions, which reduced the engineer's testing window and left Verstappen with a car that wasn't yet fully understood. In Formula One, it's not enough to have better parts. It takes time, data, and adjustments to integrate them effectively. Without that, even a good idea can backfire. And that's precisely what happened at Spa. The car had potential, but it wasn't tuned, it wasn't balanced, and that ended up being reflected in the results. The real problem wasn't so much that the package didn't work at Spa, but that it generated more doubts than certainties within the team's technical team. Are they interpreting the data correctly? Are they making the right strategic decisions based on the type of circuit? Is the team aligned in its development vision? All this is happening as the championship slips away from Red Bull and McLaren consolidates its position as the new benchmark. However, as is often the case in Formula One, what is planned at the factory doesn't always translate precisely on the track. The improvements had very specific goals: increased downforce, improved cooling, and overall more competitive efficiency in medium and low-speed corners. On paper, these features were supposed to make the RB21 a more balanced car, more resistant to wear, and more responsive in mixed conditions. But the performance observed at Spa raised legitimate questions about whether the team had truly got its interpretation of the circuit and its context right. One of the highlights of the new package was the increase in downforce, especially at the front and rear ends of the car. Ideally, this additional downforce should translate into greater cornering stability, better traction on slow exits, and a more solid feel for the driver, especially in the more technical sections of the track. At Spa, this improvement was noticeable in certain specific sections of the track, where Verstappen managed to maintain a reasonable pace through the tight corner sequences. This also helped reduce rear tire degradation on long runs, a weakness that had been evident in previous races. Furthermore, the cooling changes proved effective in avoiding thermal issues, even with the changing weather conditions. But alongside these advantages, underlying problems also emerged. The most obvious was the increase in drag, a direct consequence of the new front wing and rear winglet designs. This additional drag severely penalized the RB21's top speed, especially on long straights like Kemmel, where Red Bull was constantly vulnerable to rival DRS. On a circuit where every tenth of a second in a straight line can mean the difference between overtaking or being overtaken, this loss was crucial. Even Verstappen, who usually compensates with his natural talent for many of the car's limitations, was unable to overcome this weakness. Another drawback was the general lack of adaptation to the circuit. Spa's variable weather conditions limited effective running time, leaving the team with less room to fine-tune the new package. Without accurate data, any attempt at optimization becomes speculative, and at such a high level of competition, decisions made without certainty tend to become risky. The team relied on prior simulations and analysis to implement changes, but the reality on the track didn't quite match the models. This disconnect between plan and execution is what ultimately left Red Bull in a compromised position. In the end, Spa left Red Bull with a bittersweet feeling. On the one hand, there were signs of technical progress, but on the other, the negative effects not only overshadowed those improvements, but also exacerbated the frustration of its star driver. What we saw at the Belgian Grand Prix wasn't simply a poor performance from Red Bull. It was a clear sign that something much deeper is happening within the team. Max Verstappen's statements didn't come out of nowhere. They are the result of weeks, even months, of accumulated tensions, of technical decisions that haven't yielded the expected results, and of an increasingly unfavorable context within a grid that no longer sees them as invincible. For years, Red Bull has been the standard to which all teams aspired. Red Bull is forced to respond, not with promises, not with empty speeches, but with concrete results. Because Verstappen isn't going to settle for technical explanations. He wants solutions, and he wants them now. What seemed like undisputed dominance is no longer so. And that's a reality the team will have to face in every race remaining. If this analysis has left you thinking, I want to know your opinion. Do you think Verstappen will stay at Red Bull after 2025 if the situation doesn't improve? Or are we seeing the beginning of a possible historic rupture? Leave your answer in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel.